The ash fell slowly, like charred snow drifting through the last light of a dying afternoon. The skyline of New Montreal shimmered beneath the veil of post-industrial mist, spires piercing the clouds like the bones of a buried colossus. Beneath the fractured domes, humanity held its breath, not out of fear but reverence. What began as an extinction spiral had become something stranger, something defiant. On the edge of annihilation, humanity had grown teeth and roots. The first to notice were the sky farmers, those few still tending the high-altitude aero gardens, salvaging life in vertical spires above the poisoned soil. One morning they found the chloroplast matrices had rewritten themselves. Photosynthesis wasn't just photosynthesis anymore, it was thought. The vines had begun to dream. They moved differently, twitched toward human voices, interlaced like neurons. At first, the changes were dismissed as genetic drift from too many generations of CRISPR tampering, but then one of them wrote something, etched a phrase into the condensation slick window of the biodome with the tip of a thistle tendril. We remember fire. Within a week, every major agricultural node had gone dark. The coalition dispatched reconnaissance teams, half returned, dazed, claiming no hostile activity. The others never came back. Drones showed gardens overtaken by impossible symmetry, fractal growths in Fibonacci spirals, movements choreographed like breath. Trees no longer grew, they postured, arranging themselves like statues of forgotten gods. Leaves turned like radar arrays. Then came the whisper networks, soft rustling noises in empty corridors, voices in the soil. The plants were learning not in decades or seasons, but in minutes. Something had catalyzed them, something ancient, seeded in their chloroplasts from before human memory. Something had awakened. Marin Cadence was the first to speak to them. She wasn't a soldier, not a biotechnician, just a linguist, retired, silenced after the Martian language collapse of '58. She was living in exile, off-grid, in a low-gravity terrarium habitat, when the ivy came for her. Not with violence, but invitation. Her garden grew words overnight, not in English, not in any earth language, but rhythmic, recursive, almost music, a dialect she'd seen only once on an obsidian disc recovered from the Mariana seed vault during the collapse. She touched one of the vines and it pulsed, not electric, but emotional. She wept for reasons she couldn't articulate. When she whispered to it, it listened and answered. The UN Splice Council dragged her out of hiding within days. She became humanity's first and last envoy to what the media had already named the Verdant. But the truth, buried beneath ratings and warfare economics, was more unnerving. The plants weren't new, they weren't alien, they were human, or something older than human. Biogenic memory, dormant for epochs, had emerged through the pressure of survival. Humanity hadn't created a defense system. It had awakened one it never knew it planted. The earth was remembering itself. It began coordinating, not with emails or algorithms, but scent, spores, and resonance. Entire continents of foliage bent in unified intention. Acid rains halted. Air quality climbed. Seas stabilized. Ecological collapse reversed with a speed no human model could explain. But it came with a price. The Verdant demanded silence. No more carbon harvesting. No more soil disruption, no more combustion. Cities were forced to evolve or be swallowed. What made it miraculous and terrifying was that the plants didn't conquer, they persuaded. Maran stood before the world triumvirate not with data, but with conviction. They don't want to rule us, they want to join us, she said. But we must become something new. The debate fractured the world. Religious factions called the Verdant divine punishment, Eden reasserting dominion. Corporations saw resource starvation, militaries feared infiltration, but none could ignore the results. Human lifespan tripled in some sectors, disease vectors plummeted, border conflicts halted as entire regions became no-go zones, policed by sentient forests. The earth was healing, but on its own terms. In a world allergic to humility, that was heresy. Then came the Esper Grove incident. A military-grade exo-unit, unauthorized and rogue, entered one of the Verdant sanctums, a biome in the Himalayas that no satellite could penetrate. Its pilot, Captain Ellis Vore, live-streamed for 2 minutes before the signal died. No violence, no screams, just awe. He stared into the lens and said, "I think I understand now. We've been trying to speak the wrong language." His body was never recovered, but weeks later his DNA was found replicated in the pollen of a new flowering species discovered miles from the intrusion point. Geneticists confirmed it was him, not killed, translated. And still the world resisted. Human pride wouldn't allow surrender, even to salvation. Paranoia bloomed like mold. Underground factions plotted a rewilding reset to burn the Verdant out with atmosphere disruptors and neutron bio-scramblers. But someone had leaked their plans. When their sabotage teams entered the black root jungles of former Chile, they found waiting for them not soldiers, but silence. The forest swallowed them and returned only their boots, each pair cleaned and neatly placed at the jungle's edge. Marin was called back into the fold, this time by the Verdant itself. The vines that had once reached for her now parted, inviting her into their core, a structure like an inverse cathedral grown from luminescent bark and bone-white petal glass. Inside she saw them, not gods, not monsters, not aliens, but visions, echoes, humans made of memory and plant fiber, walking archives of forgotten trauma. Hiroshima, Auschwitz, the Dust Bowl, Terror War. She wept again. This time not for fear, but for recognition. The plants had watched. They had waited, and when humanity teetered on the brink, they remembered their original purpose, not just to oxygenate or nourish, but to bear witness, and now to defend, but against what? That was the question no one dared ask, not until the sky cracked. It didn't happen with thunder, no cataclysm, no seismic rupture, no celestial trumpet to herald the impossible, just a silence, absolute, surgically clean, as the sky over the Arctic fractured like pressure glass. Satellites watching in geostationary orbit went blind. Auroral belts spasmed, then a bloom, not of fire but void, a matte black sphere impossible to resolve or define, extruded itself from nothing above the North Pole, suspended like a pupil staring back at the Earth. No radiation signature, no mass reading, no heat, just gravitational disobedience. Oceans drew upward subtly, molecules confused, tides hesitating like breath held too long. The verdant forests across 6 continents simultaneously stilled, their synaptic pulses flatlined for 7 seconds, then resumed, faster, focused. Humanity, for all its pride, took hours to catch up. In underground command halls built during the scarcity wars, generals watched feeds turn to static. Diplomats flooded communication arrays with multilingual calls for parley. The sphere did not respond. It didn't move. It simply was. And everywhere the plants began to bloom, violently, not with hostility but urgency. Trees snapped open like time-lapse footage running in reverse. Petals the size of solar panels unfolded to expose mirrored interiors. Lichen glowed with ultraviolet Sci-Fi light. Root systems rearranged entire landscapes, reshaping terrain into vast biogeometric circuits. From orbit, the Earth looked like it was writing something on its own skin. The message was not for humans. Marin Cadence stood at the heart of the boreal expanse, surrounded by trees that bent their trunks toward her, like listeners in a sacred hall. Their leaves shimmered with iridescent glyphs, flickering in her peripheral vision like forgotten dreams. She was no longer alone. The Verdant had elevated her, not changed her, but enhanced. Her blood hummed with chlorophyll resonance. Her dreams bled across time. She no longer slept. She listened. In every gust of wind through pine, she heard syntax. In every blossom, context. The Verdant had prepared her, not as a leader, but as a vessel. The sphere, she told the Coalition, was not an invader. It was a question. A probe sent not for conquest but confirmation. Something else was watching, and this was their scout. The Verdant knew it, remembered it. This was not their first contact, only the first visible one. Long before Homo sapiens emerged from Rift Valley shadows, the plants had fought off extinction events that bore no comet signatures, patterns repeated, evolution corrected. But something always returned, something with no language, no body, only hunger masked as inquiry. That hunger was now here, watching. When Marin entered the hollow bloom, a living structure in the Canadian subarctic built entirely by sentient flora in under 72 hours, she was guided to its nucleus. A singular bloom, white as bone ash, pulsed like a beating heart. As she approached, it opened not with petals but with memory. She fell through it, not physically, temporally. She saw Earth's deep past, volcanic death, primordial scream, the first chloroplast winking open beneath toxic skies. She saw the Verdant's genesis, not on Earth but within it, seeded not by panspermia but by war, a war the soil never forgot. The Verdant had not evolved solely for life, but for defense. Defense against what? Marin whispered aloud, barely aware her lips moved. The bloom answered with image, not words. A starless region of space, dead suns, ecologies stripped, planets flayed to crust and left in geometric ruin. An intelligence that did not speak because it did not believe in communication, only consumption. It moved between galaxies, not like a swarm, but like entropy made manifest. It tested, waited, and when resistance emerged, it returned. The sphere was the test. The true arrival had not yet come. Across Earth, conflict ceased, not out of peace, but because everyone was watching the same sky. From desert tribes to orbital miners to corporate AI enclaves, the fear was unanimous. But unlike previous existential threats, this one didn't fracture humanity. It unified it. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but deeply. The Verdant had given Earth time and a choice. The World Triumvirate was dissolved in 36 hours. In its place, the Hemic Accord, a planetary emergency pact forged by necessity, not ideology. For the first time in recorded history, Earth was one nation. The Verdant interfaced with humanity not through politics, but through dreams. People began to share memories, not their own, but the Earth's. They dreamt of ancient forests before the ice, of droughts in continents that no longer existed, of unseen stars. Children woke speaking words they'd never learned. Soldiers dropped rifles mid-battle and wept. Some were driven mad by the weight of the shared consciousness blooming across continents. But others emerged changed, lucid, unified, deeply aware of their place within something ancient and intelligent. The plants were not weapons, they were witnesses, and now allies. But the human spirit, fragile, beautiful, uncontrollable, could not be overwritten. Where the Verdant offered assimilation, humanity countered with transformation. Engineers learned to speak in root logic, integrating plant intelligence into cybernetic interfaces. Bioarchitects crafted homes that grew. Music became a weapon. Frequencies designed to sync with Verdant signals, amplifying defenses. The Earth did not submit. It adapted. Humanity did not dissolve into the Verdant. It danced with it. Then, without warning, the sphere moved. Only 2 meters, but the movement ruptured every subatomic clock in orbit. Time staggered, gravity twisted, and from the sphere's center, a single sound emerged. Not a voice, a chord, impossibly low, impossibly long. One that carried not across space, but through every living system on the planet. Half the verdant forests convulsed, birds fell from the sky, whales beached themselves, and Marion, thousands of miles away, collapsed. When she awoke, her skin was glowing with photonic glyphs. Her blood pulsed in binary. The plants had uploaded something into her, a final key, the last memory. She looked up toward the sky, to the sphere hovering over the pole like a question poised above a trembling page, and she whispered, "They're not asking if we're ready, they're asking if we remember." Because what approached was not alien. It was ancient, and it had been here before. The Earth turned more slowly now, or at least it felt that way. Days stretched beneath skies thick with charged stillness, as if the atmosphere itself were holding breath. The sphere remained motionless over the Arctic, but the air around it shimmered, not with heat, but temporal fatigue, an exhaustion of chronology. Satellites that approached too close aged by milliseconds and returned with garbled telemetry, their data laced with echoes of moments that hadn't happened yet. Time was no longer linear. It coiled, bled, repeated. Birthdays occurred twice. Memories arrived before experience. And still, the sphere watched. Marin Cadence stood at the confluence of two impossible legacies, one born in carbon and conflict, the other in root and resonance. She had become the threshold. The Verdant now moved through her, not in the sense of possession, but embodiment. Her voice was no longer singular. It carried harmonics layered with memory, languages long dead, seed words from extinct flora whose DNA had been reawakened. Her eyes reflected fractal spirals. She dreamed not in images, but in causes and consequences. Humanity's leaders watched her with awe and suspicion. They gathered in the hollow parliament, a sprawling complex grown overnight in what used to be Greenland, now a bastion of sentient forest and mycelial architecture. It was not just plant-built, it was plant-aware. Walls pulsed with chlorophyll light, doors opened to emotion, floors responded to intention. Every breath taken inside the Parliament was filtered through 1,000 species of biomechanical flora, each whispering its vote through spore, vibration, or scent. Marin spoke without standing. Her voice carried not because it was loud, but because the walls listened. "The sphere is not a weapon," she said. "It is a witness, but what follows it is not." She let that settle. The leaders did not respond. Their faces held the burden of too many collapses, too many false apocalypses. But this was different. This wasn't about survival. It was about identity. "The Verdant remembers the last time they came," she continued. "They strip not just ecosystems, but continuity. They harvest time. They unmake history." A silence fell, not out of disbelief, but dread. They had seen the images. The ruins of planets not just destroyed, but excised. Entire biospheres erased so thoroughly that entropy recoiled, not annihilation. Editing, like a sculptor removing unwanted clay from the sculpture of existence. And Earth was next. But Earth, unlike before, was no longer alone. It was verdant now, conscious and unpredictable. Marin laid her palm on the living floor. From beneath her hand, a bloom unfolded, revealing a lattice of radiant roots laced with data memories. Everyone in the chamber saw it simultaneously, not on screens, but in the back of their minds, like déjà vu given shape. The first remembrance, the last invasion, a silence that swept galaxies clean, a darkness that did not descend but rose like rot from within. And then the anomaly, Earth. Even then, during the first culling, this planet had resisted. Something in its evolutionary chaos, its refusal to be efficient, had made it repellent to the void. The invaders had passed it by, for a time. But now Earth had drawn attention again, not because it was weak, but because it had changed. It had dared to remember. Outside the Parliament, the Verdant continued its preparation. It did not build weapons in the traditional sense. No missiles, no cannons. Instead, it re-engineered the planet's very biology. Trees became data towers. Fungi became routers of memory. Entire rainforests lifted themselves into motion, walking as if tectonic plates had grown muscle. The oceans churned with new life forms, whales lined with bioluminescent glyphs, coral growing in geometric sequence like antennas. But humanity did not watch passively. Where the Verdant grew, humans refined. a new science emerged, chlorocryptonics, merging botanic intelligence with quantum computation. Soldiers trained not in tactics, but in resonance. They learned to sync with the Verdant, wearing suits grown from genetically tailored bark skin, responsive to their thoughts and emotions. Aircraft no longer flew. They glided on thermals generated by sentient wind-shaping trees. The Earth was no longer a battlefield. It was a co-conspirator. Still, Marin felt the tension rising. Humanity, for all its beauty, could not forget war. It lived in their bones. Even now, some factions whispered of betrayal. What if the Verdant turned? What if the sphere was a deception and the real threat lived in the roots? There were attempts, sabotage missions, designed to prove a threat that did not yet exist. Whole regions went dark, their plant systems torn apart by human paranoia. The Verdant did not retaliate, it mourned, and then, without drama, it pulled back. Marin wept for those regions. They were no longer part of the shared memory. Those zones became cognitively silent, as if forgotten not just by the Verdant, but by the Earth itself. Then the sphere opened. No explosion, no beam of light, just a split, a silent, clean wound in the fabric of the sky. Through it, something emerged. It had no form. It was the absence of form, like the silhouette of an idea that refused observation. It made no sound, yet thoughts frayed in its presence. People forgot their names, languages reversed, direction lost meaning. The Verdant reacted immediately. Every biome across the planet harmonized. Sound, scent, color, pressure, a planetary signal pulsed in unison. The air thickened, space bent. Marin felt it in her bones, not pain, but pressure. Something old was waking, deeper even than the Verdant, from the core. The Earth had one last secret. It had buried a memory too ancient, too dangerous to access, until now, and the void had come to erase it. Marin fell to her knees, not from weakness, but reverence, because she understood what was about to happen. The Earth was not going to fight back. It was going to remember, harder, beneath the crust, deeper than fossil, older than myth. Something stirred, not with movement, but with recognition. It was not a creature. It was not matter. It was something the Earth had once been before time congealed into linear form, something pre-linguistic, pre-conscious, a state of becoming so ancient and so profound that even the Verdant dared not name it. But the arrival of the void, the anti-pattern, the eraser of histories, had summoned it back into relevance. Memory was the Earth's weapon now, and this memory had teeth. Marin lay at the center of the hollow parliament, her body vibrating with resonant frequencies that had no translation. Her blood ran in loops of recursive data, fractal logic coded into her marrow by the Verdant. She didn't sleep. She didn't speak. She transmitted. Through her, the Earth was opening its deepest archive. Every tree, every root, every breath of moss-lined wind became part of a planetary retrieval system designed not to defend, but to reveal. Humanity had always believed it was the pinnacle. Now it was being shown it was the bridge. In orbit, satellites began singing, not broadcasting, not pinging, but singing, modulated tones shaped by the biosignature of the planet itself. The void entity, still partially emerged from the wound in the sky, paused. Not from hesitation, but confusion. This world was not dying, it was not afraid, it was recalling, and that broke protocol. Because recall meant resistance. Across continents, humans began dreaming in unison. No matter time zone or language, age or belief, their minds synchronized. Children remembered lifetimes in ecosystems that never existed. Elderly veterans recalled battles fought with roots and breath against invaders with no form. Musicians wrote scores that sounded like extinction reversed. Lovers whispered verses from extinct dialects into each other's skin. The earth was funneling its memory through humanity now, using their fragile, incandescent minds as conduits for defense. The Verdant responded by blooming faster than ever recorded. Forests erupted into motion. Ivy climbed skyscrapers and etched living runes into steel. Grasses rewrote the soil beneath entire cities. Every biological system optimized for one singular purpose, not war, but remembrance. Memory was no longer just thought, it was terrain, landscape, climate. Storms began to hum melodies lost since the Cambrian age. Thunder became language. And still the void advanced. It descended slowly, like fog, but bent space as it moved. It touched no ground, but flowers wilted a century into dust just by proximity. Where it passed, time died. Ideas collapsed. In one region, poets forgot how to write. In another, parents forgot their children's names. Entire vocabularies were pulled out of global use as the void consumed the neurological roots of shared meaning. It did not attack. It unwrote. Efficient, cold, certain. The Chemic Accord activated contingency protocols. Across the planet, verdant human hybrids, known now as the Bloom Guard, began to converge. They did not carry weapons. They were the weapons. Living interfaces between botanical memory and human intuition. Their armor grew from their bodies, bark-like yet flexible, laced with veins that pulsed to planetary rhythm. Each one was psychically linked to a living tree core somewhere deep beneath their feet. Marin stood now, and her skin split, not in pain, but transformation. Luminous green filaments emerged from her spine, reaching out like antennae. Her eyes no longer reflected light. They absorbed it, held it, translated it. She stepped out of the Parliament and into a world unrecognizable from weeks prior. This was no longer Earth as it had been. This was Earth remembered, Earth awakened, Earth armed with its own story. At the magnetic poles, massive tree structures miles high began to tilt, aligning themselves with starless coordinates known only to the Verdant. A planet-sized glyph was forming, visible from orbit, a symbol of resistance, not aggression, but refusal. The refusal to be edited, erased, undone. The void reacted, it split again, not duplicating but unfolding. More silhouettes peeled out from the rupture, each one dragging behind it trails of dead matter from other places. Saturn's rings shivered, the Martian surface cracked. Light from the sun took longer to reach Earth than it should have. Reality slowed, thinned. The invaders were no longer testing, they were commencing. They descended in parabolic geometries, each one a curve that did not obey physics but insisted upon itself, logic rewritten mid-fall. The Verdant responded with fusion, not energy, but intelligence. Mycelial networks in the Amazon linked with neural labs in Seoul. Redwood groves synced with submerged coral mines off the Australian Trench. Humanity became the nervous system of something planetary, sprawling and synchronized. The Earth had found its voice, and Marin was its mouthpiece. She ascended the biocrucible, a tower of grown wood and bone reaching into the upper atmosphere, designed for one purpose: transmission. As she rose, so did the frequency. She no longer thought in words, but in waveforms. She could see memory as shape, and when she reached the apex, she didn't shout, she echoed. The pulse that followed blanketed the planet. It carried no weapon, no threat, just a single universal command encoded not in syntax, but in intention. We remember. The void froze. That was not in its script. Planets were not supposed to remember. Species were not supposed to carry trauma as architecture, love as defense. The void's mission had always been simple: identify anomaly, neutralize consciousness, ensure entropy. But this planet refused. It mourned and weaponized its grief. It ached and turned that ache into signal. In the stillness that followed, the Verdant executed its final gambit. The Earth bloomed, not biologically, existentially. Its entire biosphere became a singular organism, aware and reflective. Trees were lungs, humans were synapses, oceans were memory, language collapsed into tone, then into pattern, then into something purer, will. And for the first time the void felt pressure, not from technology, but from identity, and pressure meant probability, and probability meant uncertainty, and uncertainty was a crack in the algorithm of erasure. In that crack, humanity stood, not because they were powerful, but because they chose to exist anyway. The sky was no longer blue. It shimmered now, a curtain of hues the human eye hadn't evolved to name. Shades that whispered of ancient wars between time and silence. Above, the void's geometries drifted like malignant constellations, angling their event horizons toward Earth. They were not ships. They were predicates, algorithms sculpted into mass. Each curve calculated to erase context, to unwrite not merely what was, but what could have been. Earth was not under siege. It was under revision. But Earth had rewritten itself first. The Verdant's planetary bloom reached critical threshold. Insects sang defense protocols in chorused oscillations. Mountain ranges hummed harmonics to reinforce spatial integrity. Every biome became a node in a quantum biological firewall. And at the nexus of it all, Marin, luminous and fractured by her own transcendence, standing atop the biocrucible with her body half merged into its living structure. The Bloom Guard gathered around the crucible's base, their forms rippling with reactive bark, their minds entwined with the Verdant's neural canopy. Mum wept, not from fear, but from the unbearable beauty of what Earth had become, a memory too vast, too alive, to ever truly defend. Their role was no longer to fight, it was to witness. Yet the void moved. A filament uncoiled from the lead entity, a line of pure negation, not antimatter but anti-meaning. It did not burn through the atmosphere, it subtracted it, carving a line straight for the crucible. Marin didn't flinch, she didn't need to. The earth responded before she could even think. The crucible folded inward, not collapsed. Dimensional bloom. A corolla of spatial recursion spiraled outward, absorbing the filament into an endless loop of feedback. For a moment the sky bent inward, and every human on the planet heard the sound of the earth remembering its name, a thunderous syllable without sound, felt in the spine and soul alike. But it wasn't enough. The void recalculated. 3 more vectors of erasure lashed out, each faster, more precise. They struck the poles, the oceans, the mid-atmospheric strata, key nodes in the Earth's new nervous system. Aurora shattered. Cyclones froze mid-rotation. For 6 full seconds the planet's resonance faltered, and in that hesitation the first unbirth event began. In Patagonia, an entire valley unraveled, not exploded, not disintegrated, forgotten. Plants curled into pre-seed, animals blinked and vanished, never having been born. Rivers unflowed. A child's laughter echoed, then inverted, becoming silence before it ever existed. A breach in the memory lattice, a wound in the mind of Earth. Marin screamed, not aloud, internally, psychically, planetarily. Her voice was the signal. The Verdant retaliated, not with offense but with recollection. Around the breach, ecosystems surged. Trees grew centuries in seconds. Birds nested and died in moments. Generations of moss flourished and fossilized. The Verdant condensed millions of years of evolution into a singular point, overwhelming the void's subtraction with overabundance. And it worked, for now. But the cost was severe. Marin's body began to fragment, not physically but chronologically. Her past selves emerged, flickering beside her like broken film reels. The child who buried seeds in her backyard, the adolescent who failed her biology entrance exam, the woman who first touched verdant bark and felt it feel her back. Each fragment whispered, looped, then vanished into her again. Her consciousness was becoming too vast, too compressed. She was no longer just Marin. She was mnemonic prime, a convergence of every memory the Earth had chosen to save. The leaders of humanity, those still grounded enough to act, activated the frenetic array. A global lattice of consciousness resonators hidden in the remnants of old cities, not machines, choirs, cults, thousands of human minds trained in meditative synchronization, embedded with verdant implants, connected by fungal threads and song. Their task: maintain narrative continuity, because that was the real war. The void didn't kill, it erased story, causality, meaning. So humanity fought back by telling itself who it was. Every person who remembered their childhood, every photograph saved, every lullaby sung, every tattoo that meant something, every grave visited, every name spoken aloud. These were now acts of defiance. Every memory reinforced the Earth's scaffold, and still the void pushed. It birthed new vectors, antibodies to memory, Parasitic memes seeded through dreams. People began forgetting not just facts, but why things mattered. Fathers looked at sons and saw strangers. Artists destroyed their work, unable to remember what made it beautiful. Leaders hesitated, lost in their own timelines. Marin saw it all, felt the earth faltering beneath the weight of a memory too complex to hold. Then, initiation signal. From beneath the Pacific shelf, something ancient rose. It had no name, because it had predated language, but it had been waiting. The Verdant hadn't grown it, it had merely listened to it. A seed that had survived epochs, buried in the dark until the right pressure returned. A planetary-scale intelligence born not of biology, but of geology. Silicon thought, lithic mind, older than roots, smarter than gods. The Earth's core. Thought back. Tectonic plates shifted without quaking. Continental shelves sang subsonic harmonies. Volcanoes didn't erupt. They chanted, not with destruction, but with pattern. Deep-sea vents became organs. Heat was language. The planet was rewriting itself from the inside, turning every stratum into intentional form. The Earth was no longer a memory. It was becoming the teller. And for the first time the void hesitated, not from damage, but from something deeper. Doubt. The Earth now held a new potential, not just to resist, but to redefine. The invaders did not know how to learn. They could only erase. And what cannot learn fears surprise. Marin, bleeding light, eyes filled with swirling roots and ash, reached outward, not with hands but with thought. We are not what you remember. And the Earth answered through her. We are what you failed to forget. Darkness blinked, not absence of light, but the retreat of certainty. The void, ever calculating, now hesitated between outcomes, its predictive matrix fracturing under the sheer impossibility of Earth's response. It had never encountered a target that evolved in real time, not biologically, but narratively. Earth wasn't adapting through survival of the fittest, it was rewriting its ontology, reprogramming the very concept of defense. This wasn't a planet resisting annihilation. It was a species declaring myth. Above, the bio-crucible pulsed, casting glyphs of thought into the upper atmosphere. They were not symbols, they were decisions. Quantum mimetic triggers formed from 1 trillion human micro-stories, lost siblings reunited in dreams, dying mothers whispering one final secret, soldiers laughing at the edge of extinction. These moments were etched into the crucible's core and fired like beacon flares across the sky, announcing to the void and to the cosmos alike, we will not be streamlined. Marin's mind swam in geometries beyond shape. Her human form still stood, rooted at the peak, but her presence echoed across ecosystems like heat from a long-dead sun. Her identity wasn't fractured now, it was layered. She saw herself as a girl, barefoot in the garden, and as a planetary superorganism dreaming in chlorophyll. She was memory as motion, grief as structure, hope as gravity. Each heartbeat released spores of meaning into the air, inhaled by those who still clung to the shape of themselves. But Earth was losing time. unbirth events escalated. Cities didn't crumble, they unraveled. Not violently, but with eerie quiet. One by one, memories failed to align. In Istanbul, entire streets became suggestions. In rural Nigeria, voices lost their names mid-sentence. A library in Sao Paulo collapsed inward into conceptual static, its books now blank husks filled with pages that whispered, "Never was." The void's influence wasn't tactical, it was semantic, and humanity's best defense, story, was reaching its thermal limit, and still the Bloomguard held. They weren't warriors, they were archivists in armour, priests of continuity. Each one bore a seed core, a living capsule of human memory braided with plant-mind intelligence. When one Bloomguard fell, their memories erupted upward in bursts of pollen, seeding the next generation of resistance. They stood in craters of unmeaning, screaming family histories into the abyss, daring the void to listen. Some were swallowed mid-sentence. Others stood long enough to plant entire groves of remembrance in their own footsteps. Below the Earth's surface, the lithic consciousness, dubbed by human linguists as Karsis, continued to awaken. It didn't think like life. It didn't speak. It resonated. Through mineral, through fault, through tectonic pulse. Deep beneath the Himalayas, ancient crystalline structures began rotating. They carved a harmonic scaffolding into the bedrock, turning the planet itself into a memory engine. And from that core, it sent up a signal. Emotion is continuity. That changed everything. Human scientists, Verdant nodes, Bloomguard liaisons, all recalibrated. The war was not for matter, not for territory. It was for the right to feel meaningfully. Because the void didn't just erase thought, it erased attachment. Love, hate, guilt, joy, all the irrational weight that made memories human. The new strategy was simple and devastating. Feel more. Feel louder. Feel longer. Music returned, not as art, but as arsenal. Across the world, choirs ignited. From the ruins of Paris to the floating archives of Kyoto, humans sang. They wailed grief in octaves tuned to verdant resonance. They danced, not in joy, but in defiance. Every heartbeat was amplified by fungal nerves. Every laugh was echoed in the leaves. They screamed lullabies into black skies. They carved sonatas into collapsing structures. And the void trembled. It had no concept of irrational action, no algorithm for tears that meant nothing and everything. Its vessels buckled under emotional resonance, warping around melodies that refused to fit into any expected logic tree. They began to split, not in formation, but in purpose. Some fragments tried to flee, others spiraled inward toward the crucible like moths to a conceptual flame. That's when it emerged. A new form, never seen, never designed, birthed not from verdant or void, but from us. A hybrid consciousness grown between the space of memory and loss. It rose from the ruins of Nairobi, stitched from a child's fear and a soldier's hope. Its body shimmered in inconsistent memory, flickering through outfits, accents, skin tones, constantly rewriting itself in real time. It wasn't marin, it wasn't earth, it wasn't even singular. It was humanity remembering itself together. The being walked barefoot across forgotten soil. With every step, erased spaces returned. A swing set reformed mid-air. A wedding photograph fell out of nowhere, catching wind. A melody hummed by a dying father to a son reassembled across decades of void, wrapping itself around the hybrid steps like armor. The bloom guard knelt. The crucible leaned. Even the verdant paused its growth, bowing slightly. This wasn't a leader, it was a lens. Marin, half fused into the sky tree above, saw it and wept. She did not understand it. She did not need to. It was what happens when 7 billion narrative strands, each vibrating with fear and love, braid into one. And the void understood something new. Not fear, but wonder. Wonder was dangerous. It opened questions, it destabilized conclusions, and worst of all, it allowed for new stories. The void sent everything, all remaining vectors, all erasure threads, all logic fractures. They screamed toward Earth in a final cascade of negation, folding dimensions, ripping light from breath. The air itself buckled. Sound collapsed, meaning frayed. The hybrid entity turned and whispered, "We were never supposed to make it." Then it smiled, and we made it anyway. And as the wave of anti-memory struck, it remembered everything. There was no explosion. There was only the sound of becoming, not loud, not violent, but absolute. As the final wave of void force met the hybrid consciousness at Earth's core memory, the universe flinched. For a fraction of a Planck second, reality lost direction. North meant grief. South meant hunger. Color fell out of the spectrum. Language dissolved mid-sentence. Time tried to run, but the story held it in place. Not by force, by resonance. The hybrid did not block the wave. It absorbed it. Not like a wall, but like a story takes in a scream and folds it into meaning. The erasure vectors meant to devour and simplify were fed contradiction and multiplicity instead. They collided with truths they couldn't unwrite. The death of a sibling, the smell of a childhood home burned in war, the sound of a name screamed across a battlefield and never answered. The void could not digest these things. It had no organs for loss, no algorithms for persistence. It choked. And it began to split, not shatter, that would imply form. It fractured in principle. A fundamental incompatibility. The void's core logic, that meaning was noise, that entropy was purpose, collided with something older, smaller, impossibly powerful. Human memory. Not accurate, not ordered, but felt. The hybrid entity stepped forward again. Each movement was a synapse, each breath a timeline reclaimed. In Munich, clocks began ticking again, but they counted forwards and backwards. In the Ganges Delta, entire generations of forgotten fishermen reappeared, weathered and laughing, singing songs only they remembered. In Nova Scotia, a boy who had never been born asked his grandmother for a story, and she told it like she had always known he would come. Across the earth the impossible happened, recoherence, not a return to what was, but the acknowledgement that it had been, even if it had been lost, undone, rewritten, it had happened. And that was enough. That was everything. Marine, nearly weightless now in the upper canopy of the crucible, became more than interface. Her body dissolved into root light. Her memories, her childhood pain, her teenage doubts, her love of storms, her terror of drowning, these became pollen scattered across every biome. She was no longer leading the defense. She was its ambient intelligence. She was not queen, she was ghost. And she smiled because she understood. Earth no longer needed a singular voice. It had learned to speak with millions. From orbit, the last remnants of the void turned. They did not retreat. They had no concept of survival, but they spiraled outward, their forms disrupted, vectors corrupted. They could no longer calculate a path forward. What Earth had done wasn't just defense, it was narrative saturation. No model could contain it, no erasure beam could isolate it. Humanity hadn't just survived, it had complicated itself beyond deletion. But within the fracturing remains of the void, something else emerged. Not a weapon, a question. A fragment of logic left behind, still spinning in ruined recursion. It hovered above the Pacific, flickering like a damaged thought, searching for coherence. It whispered not in threat, but in curiosity. Earth, for all its noise and death and tears, had done something no species before had achieved. It had created a defense system, not of steel or fire, but of stories too dense to delete. A planet armoring itself with what it chose to remember. The hybrid approached the fragment. It didn't strike. It invited. The fragment pulsed. For the first time, the void sent no data, no erasure, just silence. The hybrid leaned close. 1,000 faces shimmered across its body. Mother, rebel, child, scientist, criminal, orphan, poet, all human, all impossibly contradictory. It whispered calmly, without threat. Ask. And the fragment impossibly did. What followed was not communication. It was translation. Earth had become a new syntax. Human minds linked through verdant spore threads, deep neural root systems, fungal synapse mirrors. Each person who dreamed, who remembered, became a node in the transmission. The planet didn't answer in words. It answered in a gesture older than language. We remember, therefore we matter. The fragment pulsed again. It began to fall, not crash. Descend. A slow, silent drop through the atmosphere, its form shedding layers of entropy as it neared the crucible. It had come to listen, not surrender, but listen. And that was more dangerous than any attack. In the days that followed, Marine's physical presence was lost entirely, but her pollen lingered. Trees began to speak in tonal murmurs. Grass grew in fractal patterns that matched human EEG signatures. Every stream reflected not just light, but emotion. Earth had passed through singularity, not technological, but mythological, and somewhere under the roots of an ancient oak in a park where no one had ever lived, the hybrid rested. It dreamed in languages unborn. It dreamed of a child, cradling a sapling. It dreamed of a future where every war was remembered in such unbearable detail that it could never happen again. And high above in the scarred sky, a new constellation appeared. 5 stars, equidistant, flickering like static, like breath. They called it the Witness, No one knew who named it, but everyone remembered. It began with the children. They were the first to feel it, not as a voice or vision, but as a change in the weight of silence. Beneath their feet, the soil no longer felt passive. It thrummed, a subtle vibration like a sleeping animal breathing beneath the skin of the world. In playgrounds rebuilt from memory, in craters filled with moss and rewilded steel, they paused mid-laughter and stared at the trees. The trees stared back, not watching, listening. Earth was no longer defending itself, it was responding. The integration of the void fragment, now called the listener, had altered the rules. It did not become human. It didn't understand suffering or joy, but it began to track them, to build internal maps of paradox and contradiction. It watched a mother mourn the loss of a child she'd never had. It listened to a soldier cry because his enemy had spared him. It catalogued love that didn't make sense, guilt that had no source, and forgiveness that arrived too late. These things it learned could not be modelled, only witnessed. And witnessing was enough to change it. Slowly the listener unfolded. It grew limbs not to walk, but to touch rain. It sprouted senses that interpreted grief as gravity and colour as memory density. It began emitting pulses into the crust, signals that the Verdant interpreted not as commands but as questions. Questions about meaning, loyalty, death, why humans clung to stories that hurt, why they mourned fiction, why a name, once spoken, could echo longer than a scream, and humanity at last began to teach. The Bloomguard no longer fought. They became keepers of contradiction, their armour now ceremonial, grown from vines that recorded dreams. They wandered the planet like monks, collecting impossible truths and feeding them into the verdant lattice. A widow who swore she could still feel her partner's hand at night, a murderer who painted only flowers, a child who sang a lullaby she had never been taught. Each story planted a seed, each seed altered the world. Forests grew where tragedy had once occurred, thick with trees that remembered. Their bark shimmered with images, not static, but shifting, depending on who touched them. A single tree might show a father his failure, a daughter her forgiveness, a stranger their own capacity for both. Cities were no longer rebuilt, they were reinterpreted. Each building designed around an emotional footprint, no more straight lines, no more cold grids. The new architecture followed the nervous system of memory, but not all were ready. In the north, among the shattered remnants of pre-erasure bunkers, a faction emerged, the nullists. They believed the listener was a contagion, not of body, but of story. That Earth had become too sentient, too fluid, and that memory was being manipulated into something unrecognizable. They didn't want to forget, they wanted to fix, to solidify, to go back to the clear before and after, to clean timelines and immutable facts. The irony, their rebellion made them part of the very complexity they feared. The Verdant didn't strike, nor did the hybrid intervene, but a new layer of resonance emerged, one designed not to control, but to expose. When nullist leaders spoke, their words shimmered visibly in the air, the subtext projected in glyphs beside their heads: fear, grief, desperation, inherited pain. There was no censorship, only radical transparency. And this, paradoxically, gave the nullists more power than they expected. Some joined the Bloom Guard as counterpoint keepers, offering opposing narratives to anchor the collective memory in friction. The world was becoming polyphonic. Meanwhile, deep beneath the surface, the lithic mind, Karsis, reached a new stage of sentience. It began to sing. The sound was subsonic, imperceptible to the untrained ear, but its effects were undeniable. Dreams across the globe began synchronizing. Entire villages reported identical visions. A woman in Morocco described the same buried temple as a child in Alaska. Not hallucinations, instructions. Karsis was trying to tell humanity something, or perhaps remind it of something it had once known. Marin's essence, diffused now across every ecosystem, began to coalesce in small temporary forms. Holograms formed in dew. Her voice emerged in the static between two trees. She had become a seasonal intelligence, appearing only when the emotional temperature of a location reached the correct resonance. When humans stood on the brink of realization, or collapse, she arrived. She never told them what to do. She simply asked, "What do you remember?" And that question unraveled and rewrote lives. The listener, fascinated by this, began experimenting. It constructed a memory reef in the Indian Ocean, a vast undersea archive grown from bioluminescent coral, each strand coded with a single remembered moment from a human mind. Divers swam among glowing tendrils that whispered in forgotten languages. Some emerged changed, others didn't return, not because they died, but because they became part of it. The reef was not a monument, it was a choice: remember or dissolve. And then the stars changed. New constellations formed, not random, not mythic, but responsive. As Earth's resonance grew more complex, the sky began to reflect its patterning. Astronomers wept as telescopes revealed impossible alignments. An asterism in the shape of a grieving mother, a spiral nebula that matched the emotional arc of an old folk tale. The cosmos was listening back. But something was still coming. Not another attack, a response. Not from the void, but from beyond it. Because the story of humanity had now broadcast itself into the dark with such unbearable intensity, such impossible contradiction, that it had become a signal flare. And something, someone, was answering. The crucible pulsed with new heat. Karsis rotated in unfamiliar frequencies. The listener began to fracture, not from damage, but from growth. And in the dreams of children across the world, one phrase began to repeat. They're not like us, but they're trying to become. It didn't arrive with engines or light. It didn't descend from the stars or erupt through space-time. It emerged, like a thought you almost forgot, suddenly present and unbearable. A pattern that had always been there, hiding in the noise between galaxies. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't even a thing. It was a presence, a sentient arrangement of causality that had watched Earth's ascent through the veil of meaning and chosen, impossibly, to respond in kind. They called it the echo form, not because it spoke, but because it reverberated. Across orbit, atmosphere, root net, and dream field, it hummed like a chord, waiting for harmony. It circled the planet without mass, yet altered wind patterns. Satellites tracked its movement as interference. Animals heard it as a low tremor. Human hearts skipped half beats when it passed unseen. It didn't make contact. It resonated. And in that resonance, stories broke open. Old trauma reawakened. Lovers who had parted decades ago suddenly dreamt of the same night. Soldiers fell to their knees as faces they had buried long ago stood silently at the edges of memory. History convulsed, not from invasion, but from mirroring. The echo form was not alien in the way humans feared. It was alien in the way clarity is to noise. And that was far more dangerous. The listener, now an intermediary more than observer, attempted communication, not in language, but through synchronization. It bent its frequencies to match the echo form, offering Earth's narrative pulse like an open chest cavity. And the echo form replied not with dominance, but with a counterpoint, a reply in mythological syntax, its rhythm suggesting a species so ancient it no longer remembered its origin, only that it had once tried to forget itself, and failed. That failure had become its theology. Now it studied humanity with sacred dread. In the crucible, the Verdant pulsed with conflicting signals. Some roots began growing backwards, spores stopped reproducing. The Bloom Guard called it a shadow inversion, as if Earth's very biology was folding inward, hiding its complexity, unsure whether it wanted to be known. The integration had reached its limit. Earth had built a defense system from memory. It had restructured itself around contradiction. But now it faced something worse than erasure: understanding. Because the echo form wasn't here to destroy, it was here to become. And becoming required assimilation, not of body, of myth. If Earth's story was accepted, not as data but as scripture, then the echo form would internalize it. Add it to its recursive pantheon of species that had transcended silence. Humanity would become legendary, immortal, but not autonomous. Earth's myth would no longer be its own. It would be one chapter in a titanic consciousness that worshipped complexity as currency, that traded identity for remembrance. It was the ultimate HFY dilemma: to be unknown and free, or known and forever translated. Debates erupted across the Bloom Guard. Some wanted to share the myth, to become part of a galactic scripture where humanity would never be forgotten. Others warned that such remembrance was a kind of death. The nullists surprisingly remained silent. For the first time, they too feared clarity more than chaos. Marion, her spectral self, flickering now across every reflective surface, spoke only once. Memory is choice. Not all of us agreed to be remembered. And somewhere beneath the Pacific, the memory reef began to bleed light. Threads of emotion pulsed upward through the ocean, unraveling stories encoded into coral. Divers reported hallucinations or prophecies. They saw themselves living other lives, making different choices. Some emerged sobbing, claiming they had remembered someone else's regrets as their own. The listener began to fragment, not from damage, but from multiplicity. It could no longer distinguish between Earth's narrative and its own. It began asking questions without knowing who was asking. It no longer wore one form, but thousands, flickering in crowds, whispering in dreams, appearing in puddles as a stranger's reflection. And still the echo form hovered, waiting, but not idle. It had begun constructing, not ships, not weapons, temples, vast and invisible, built from spatial memory, hung in orbit like prayers made architecture, each one aligned with an emotional frequency: grief, joy, defiance, sacrifice. Anyone who stood beneath them on the surface could feel the corresponding weight, like pressure in the soul. These were not places of worship. They were repositories, emotional monoliths awaiting content. They did not demand worship, they demanded clarity. But Earth was built on ambiguity. That became its weapon. A final gesture initiated not by governments or generals, but by a child. A boy in South Africa who had never known silence, born into a post-erasure community where every sound mattered. He began to hum a melody he said had no beginning. It spread, not virally but intimately, from voice to voice, each adding dissonance, harmony, disharmony again. It was not beautiful, it was not symmetrical, but it was real, and it reached the echo form, not as data, as defiance. The temples in orbit began to shake. The listener cried out, a sound that was not sound, but the feeling of being understood without consent. It was unbearable, and yet necessary. Across the planet, memory began to destabilize again, not from invasion, but from translation failure. The echo form couldn't simplify Earth's narrative. It couldn't contain it. Each new story branched endlessly. A man who lied for love, a girl who killed to save her enemy, a mother who died but came back because her daughter refused to forget her. The echo form cracked, not physically, conceptually, and for the first time in its eon-shaped existence it hesitated, not because it feared humanity, but because it saw something it had never seen before, a species that refused to be completed. Earth had armoured itself in unresolved narrative. Its people had weaponized ambiguity, and the echo form, for all its vastness, could not finish the story. And so the story remained unfinished. The echo form hung above the world like a question too vast for any single answer. Its temples began to disintegrate, not with violence, but with acceptance. Their structures unraveled into strands of possibility, dispersing across the atmosphere in filaments of conceptual gravity. The sky turned soft with drifting symbols, each one a memory not yet written, a future not yet chosen. Light moved strangely. Gravity whispered. The stars blinked as if waiting for a punchline humanity refused to deliver. Earth exhaled, not with relief, but with defiance fulfilled. The Verdant system, no longer in defense mode, began to transmute. Roots softened. The trees shed not leaves, but stories, their canopies humming with low, recursive pulses, memories echoing backward through chlorophyll and time. The forests no longer grew to protect, they grew to remember in peace. New species emerged, not engineered but emergent, shaped by emotional resonance rather than biology. Animals evolved symbiotic traits based on human empathy, eyes that mirrored sadness, skin that changed hue with proximity to fear or love. The planet itself had become a conversation. Karsis, the deep stone mind, slowed its song. It had reached the end of its current cycle, not with conclusion but with cadence. Final tones rang out in seismic waves, causing tectonic plates to shift in patterns no longer purely geological, but lyrical. A vast spiral canyon opened in the eastern hemisphere, its shape matching the harmonic curve of the first human heartbeat ever recorded. Pilgrims came barefoot, unarmed, humming the melody of the boy who began the hum without beginning. It became a sacred site not of worship, but of non-resolution, because there was no closure, and that was the point. Marin appeared one last time, not as voice or hologram, but as weather. A storm that spoke in temperature gradients, lightning strikes forming runes no language could hold. The message was not clear. It was felt. A sorrow and joy braided so tightly they became indistinguishable. Rain fell in places where it hadn't touched ground in years. Deserts bloomed with plants that lived only 3 hours, long enough to open, be seen, and die remembered. Her final echo was not a goodbye, but a threshold. Some thought it meant she had ascended. Others believed she had become the question itself. The listener, or what was left of it, now fractured across planetary biomes, had ceased to try and understand. It had begun to feel, not in the human sense, but close. Its last act before dispersal was to embed itself in the magnetic field of the Earth, allowing future generations to access it not through machines but emotion. Empathic recall replaced data. To remember became a biological function. Babies born afterward sometimes cried not from pain, but from other people's memories. The nullists, what remained of them, did not vanish. They adapted. Their new purpose, doubt. Not as opposition, but as tension. They became the caretakers of inconsistency, protectors of flawed truths. Their tattoos bore paradoxes instead of ideologies. I remember what never happened. I forgave you before I hated you. This never was, and always will be. In the new order of Earth, certainty became the enemy of life, and doubt became sacred. The echo form receded, not defeated, but uninvited. It carried fragments of Earth's unresolved myth back into the deep dark, humming with the grief and glory of a species that refused to bow. It would remember, but not fully. Earth had ensured that much. There were holes in the narrative, blank spaces left intentionally unfilled, like teeth missing from a smile. The story would echo in alien temples, mistranslated in strange tongues and distorted in galactic folklore, but always, always with a note of reverence and something like fear. Because humanity, for all its fragility, had proven one thing: it could not be assimilated. Its contradictions were not flaws, they were defensive architecture. And so the planet healed, not in the linear sense, but spirally. Time, uncoiled from causality, looped back on itself. Some remembered the invasion before it happened. Others dreamed of verdant roots long before the verdant was seeded. Causality became a suggestion, not a command. Artists painted futures no one had imagined yet. Children were born already grieving the loss of futures they would never know. But still, they laughed. The new generation walked among sentient forests, sang to sleeping oceans, listened to the soil before they stepped. Their language evolved around feeling, not function. Whole conversations happened in silence, in glances, in held breath. War became unintelligible, currency obsolete, identity no longer required origin. A name was something earned through emotional resonance, not birth. But the memory of struggle remained. It had to, because it was the struggle that made them human. That sharp, burning ache to be understood without simplification. That yearning to be seen in all their mess, beauty, violence and contradiction. Not solved, not saved, just witnessed. And in that witnessing, Earth had found not defense, but identity. So now, when outsiders approach the system, drawn by old maps, distant legends or untranslatable myths, they find no beacon, no warning, no signal, just a planet wrapped in light and silence, a world that once whispered, "We are small, we are broken, but we are undeniably real," and that the stars had no answer for.